Father Anthony has in the past been a valued contributor to Spiritfest. He's a Catholic priest based at present in Johannesburg, where he works at the Jesuit Institute, South Africa, and the Steve Biko Center for Bioethics at Wits. But he's about to move to Nairobi. We at Spiritfest know him as a provocative lecturer and as an actor in one-man plays, which he also writes. His play about the late Archbishop Romero was received to acclaim on Spiritfest. Normally, it's not easy for Anthony to come and join us all the way from Johannesburg, but if there's one compensation for this horrific pandemic, it is that Joburg is as close as next door when we are using Zoom. Good to have you with us, Anthony.
Thank you, and great pleasure to be here.
Mignonne Breier grew up here in the Eastern Cape, mainly right here in Makanda, Grahamstown. She's worked as a journalist, lecturer, and researcher. She retired from UCT in 2019, but remains an honorary research associate in the School of Education at UCT, still lives in Cape Town, and a consultant on research and development. It was over 10 years ago that she embarked in her spare time on the extensive research which led to her writing Bloody Sunday. Some of us knew that at the time of the Defiance campaign in 1952, a Catholic nun had died in East London in a riot. Fewer knew the rumors about cannibalism connected to that story, but almost entirely suppressed, except in the memories of Duncan village residents, was the massacre that followed, perpetrated by the apartheid police, which Mignonne's researches uncovered. Her methods were painstaking and thorough. Her writing, happily for her readers, is anything but dry. Bloody Sunday is a gripping read. I highly recommend this book. Let me hand over to Father Anthony and to the author of Bloody Sunday, Mignonne Breier.
Thank you, Maggie. Thanks, Maggie. I hope everyone can hear me. I always have great fear that I'm talking into a screen and no one can just see, or they can see my lips moving. Mignonne, I'm going to kick off right away with a question about how you actually came to write the book. I'm always interested in why people write what they write. And I know in the beginning you talk about the fact that you remember when you were a child, I think, your mother mentioned the nun that had been murdered. But then, you know, that was quite a while before. That was in the 60s, I think, when you were told that. And yet, you know, years later, you come to write the book. Can you talk about how you came to write the book? What motivated you?
Yes, thank you. And I must just, if I may, just start by thanking you all at Spiritfest. I will reveal it soon, but Spiritfest is actually a very important influence, or was a very important influence in my finishing the book, and I'll explain that. But the start of the book is, I was told the story when I was young. I'm not sure exactly what age, but I remember my mother telling me about a nun who was burned to death in the township where she worked. And my parents had been mission educators, and this was a kind of cautionary tale. Don't go and do what we did. Don't go and work in townships. You're going to be the first person to be killed. That was the story. It was at the back of my mind, subconsciously, I think. I never pursued the issue with my mother, but it stayed with me. And many, many years later, after my mother died, at least 20 years after my mother died, I started researching my parents' lives. I'd done a whole sort of about turn, given up my research job. My son had died, and I'd done a kind of a change of life, as it were, and I started looking at my parents' lives, and I was very interested in what they'd done in the missions. They were teachers at mainly Methodist missions in what was then the Transkei. And in the process, friends and colleagues who were historians would give me articles about the Eastern Cape, and I collected more and more information. I was interested in Heeltown particularly. And then one day an article came my way by Leslie Bank, actually. It was written about Donald Card, the policeman. And in that article, there was a reference to Sister Aden. And I thought, okay, this is probably the woman that my mother was referring to. But it was only after I found my mother's Bible. Actually, my sister, Fr Jones, who's in Grahamstown or Makanda, she had kept my mother's Bible, and she pointed out that in this Bible there was a cutting. So I found a cutting, which one was of Sister Aden, and just mentioned that she had been killed in the township, and the other cutting was of the school that was demolished. Sorry, can you hear me? I'm just seeing the wrong person here. Okay. And then I started doing the research, and I became fascinated by the fact that the story had been buried. You know, more than anything, that the more people told me that, you know, I shouldn't do it and I shouldn't go into this dark chapter, the more I wanted to, I'm afraid. And then if I may just tell the story of Spiritfest, because I often wanted to put this this research aside and get on with my life, really. But one of the factors was actually the 2016 Spiritfest. I came, and Father Anthony, I actually saw you do your play on Oscar Romero, which was most impressive. And then I actually attended a talk about Benedict Dusmer, and I think that was Francis Williamson. And that same 2016 event, or National Arts Festival, there was also on the other side of town, far from the mainstream churches, in Albany Road, which leads to quite a poor area, there was in a hall, there was a play about Sister Aden that was being put on by students or young people from Duncan Village. The play was called The Cannibalizing of an Irish Nun, and it was a song and dance musical, beautifully presented. I went there with Maggie Clark and with my sister Fleur, and we sat among, it was entirely a township audience. There were some sisters who had come from Duncan Village, who I knew, but for the rest, it was mostly in isiXhosa, and we didn't understand a lot, but I did understand enough to say that there they were telling the story of Sister Aden as if she was a martyr. They told about the horrors of the township and the way the police had been behaving, but they also presented her as someone who performed a miracle of bringing a baby back to life, a dead baby. And they ended the play with an apology to the family of Sister Aden. So that was, at that point, I was actually wanting to abandon my research and give up. But I thought there's something here that I should do, because why is it that the mainstream churches don't know about Sister Aden? Why the people from Duncan Village, where she was actually killed, are celebrating her, and there must be something here that is missing. And then, of course, the more I knew about the massacre, the more I felt that I had to talk about that, because when I had been told about Sister Aden, nobody told me about Black people being killed, not even the 8 people who officially were killed. So that was the kind of driving force. And I wanted to tell a balanced story. It's a long answer to yours.
Yeah, that's a fascinating journey, I think, you know, in terms of, the question obviously that many people would ask was, why was the story covered up? It's always a complicated one. I mean, if you think of it from the point of view of the time, 1952, the Defiance campaign, I mean, if you look at the whole story, there's the story of the murder of Sister Aden and the and the insurance man, the two white people who were killed, in the initial, protest after the meeting was suppressed.
Yes.
And then, of course, the massacre that followed. And, you would have expected that a massacre of that magnitude, which, I mean, it was bigger than Sharpeville. I did a check on that. Sharpeville, there were 69 people killed. The minimum you calculate is 80, and could have been up to 200. Why it was never really sort of publicized, why people never talked about it. Why, for example, the ANC didn't say what the hang was going on there, why was there so many people dead. It was almost as if it was a kind of embarrassment, political embarrassment. What do you think of that hypothesis?
Well, absolutely. I think that if the massacre happened in two stages, if I must just say. There was, first of all, a killing of about eight people who were attending a meeting. And then the crowd went on a rampage, killed the white insurance salesman and killed Sister Aden. After that, when the police discovered her body and the body of the insurance salesman, there was the main massacre, which went on for hours by all accounts. And it was the reason why it was suppressed. I mean, it is known, the first massacre, the first killing, they were dispersing the crowd, is relatively well known by those people who know the story. But the rest is not so. And I think it's because of what happened to Sister Aden, what was done to her, because her body was mutilated in such a way. I think the whole story became beyond the pale. It was just something you couldn't speak about. It was difficult for white people who wanted to, it was in their interests to, the National Party, for example, to make a big deal of what, their so-called enemy were up to. But even they held back because of the atrocities, I think, that the police had committed. I think that they were sufficiently sensitive to the issues at that stage. They later got more hardened. But certainly from the ANC's point of view, I mean, I experience this to this day, where the conversation just gets completely shut down around the question of what happened to her body. It's just, people cannot talk about it. It's just enters an area of taboo. And in a way, the acknowledgement of the deaths of all the other people has gone by the wayside because no one is prepared to admit to what happened to her. And you can't really tell the full story without, you won't understand the second massacre without knowing what happened to Sister her, what happened to her.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I mean, I was looking at the references that you used, and they're absolutely extensive. I mean, very impressive archival research. And I noticed that in the acknowledgements, you acknowledge, archivists at Fort Hare, where the main ANC archive is. And yet, I don't think you use any of them in your actual text or in your reference. I didn't go through every single reference you wrote. I mean, I'm pedantic, but I'm not that obsessive. But my sense is, did you not find in the personal papers of some of the people who were around, the activists, particularly in the Eastern Cape, letters and conversations, for example, saying, how the hell are we going to sort of deal with the fact that 200 people were killed and we can't talk about it?
Well, if you go to the archives in you won't find those papers. I mean, the papers that I found don't go back as far as the 50s. And the one set of papers that I thought might be helpful, which is Oliver Tambo's papers, went back as far as the 60s, some date in the 60s, and the whole collection had been spirited off to the Thule House. So I couldn't access it. But from the Fort Hare archives, I got copies of, the left newspapers, Advance, Clarion, which also available in the Wits archive. Actually, there are very, very few personal papers left from that period. I think one of the problems is that people were operating, under huge surveillance, and the police were after them all the time. It wasn't an era where you kept papers. I mean, your papers would be incriminating. Yeah, and then there was an interesting collection of interviews with Walter Sisulu before he died, which I thought would be helpful. First of all, he barely mentions what happened, even though he was in East London that day, and then suddenly the records the conversation comes to an abrupt end at that point. So I don't know. Unfortunately, these people all died, years before I began my research. Even Mandela died before, before I started. And I really didn't find those records that I hoped. I had to rely on secondary sources, the biographies that they'd written, or about, and the general position was that the ANC disengaged itself from what happened in Duncan Village and in the other towns where there were riots. They said they were not responsible, they had nothing to do with it. And they set a death toll, a standard death toll of 40 across the 4 cities, which was totally incorrect, actually.
Yeah. No, it's a problem, I think, with doing historical research, particularly, I suppose it's the kind of stuff, if you're dealing with history that goes back many centuries, you accept the fact that the primary sources will be very slim. There will be mostly written, published texts, and maybe a handful of old manuscripts. But when you're dealing with modern history, 20th century history, you hope to find the mother lode. You hope to find amazing collections of papers. Now, so yeah, I know what it feels like, struggling with, finding archives. So, in a sense, they can only help so much.
But as you say, when you publish something, people come out of the woodwork, if I may put it that way. Yeah. And I am beginning to find that, yes.
So you will hopefully, when you do the revised edition for the international publication of it, you will have a whole lot of extended
maybe.
Look, that will be fantastic. I was actually interesting, just as a footnote, I was talking to a friend of mine who is an editor of a Catholic magazine in New York, and he's interested in an article on this. So hopefully I will write something on your researches, and hopefully that might even nudge a foreign publisher. But in any case, let's get back to this question of the process of the research and some of the questions that the book raises. Sister Aden, let's look at her as a person. Obviously when you did all this research, you interviewed family members, you interviewed members of her community who were still alive. What kind of picture of her did you develop? And how did you represent her in the book, in a sense? Obviously when you interview people, you get a sense of somebody, and then when you write it, sometimes things you leave out, sometimes things you gloss over, you think, well, that's an interesting hypothesis, but there's not enough evidence based on interviews, based on documents. So what kind of picture did you form of her in your mind as you wrote the book?
It's interesting because I struggled a lot to actually grasp her, if I may put it that way. I wonder if it was because there was such a big difference between my life and hers. Living in South Africa in this generation, I'm not Catholic. She came from a very Catholic family, and was steeped in Catholicism to the extent that when she came to Wits, for example, she was just amazed that there were so many Jewish people at the university, and it was. But okay, so in fact, it was only right at the end when I was in Ireland and visiting the places where she grew up, and then particularly in the town of Youghal, which was a seaside town which she used to visit regularly. It was her happiest time was there, and she loved the place. And it was somehow there, I kind of felt I got to know her. But she was a complex character, I think. She obviously was somebody who had periods of outgoing happiness, friendliness, but also withdrawn at times and depressed at times. One doesn't know what she was struggling with in those times, but certainly towards the end of her life, I think she had a very difficult life. But started out with a very privileged life. She came from a wealthy family, a well-to-do family, and she grew up in Ireland in County Cork, and her father was a businessman and farmer. She seemed to have a happy childhood, and in fact did not seem to be particularly religious when she decided to become a nun. And that is the interesting thing for her family and her friends. You know, why did she decide to become a nun? And I think for me, one of the most interesting books I read was a PhD thesis turned into a book about why women joined the orders in that period, in the 1930s. Okay. And it was what few options there were for them. You either married, and it was a time of economic hardship, so you were not likely to be wealthy. You were likely to have a lot of children. If you didn't marry and became a spinster, your life was going to be really tough, because you probably have to live with your brother and his family. That seems the kind of norm. You could join. The other option was to join a convent, and if you were adventurous, then the possibility of going to joining an order that had missionary outreach was exciting. And I think she was exposed to people who had been on the missions. And then she also had this childhood friend who was her friend her whole life, a priest who became a priest about 6 years before she did, and went to Port Elizabeth. So she obviously had heard about life in South Africa and the challenges, and I think for someone who wanted to save souls and look after other people, it was very healing to her. This particular man, Father John Power, was a lifelong friend. I mean, I don't think there was anything ever improprietous in the relationship, but I think it was a very close friendship, and I'm sure it did have an influence in her choice. But as her life developed, she definitely became a much more devout religious woman, and the descriptions of her by the other nuns who lived with her show that. And it seemed that she changed a lot and became very spiritual and very hardworking. She was always hardworking, but turned inwards towards the end of her life. And unfortunately, there were a lot of statements written about her after she died. The irony is, because she died in such a horrible way, people retained all the correspondence they had with her. So her family kept all her letters. So I had 60 letters to read, or more than 60. And the nuns had written pages and pages about her that I could go through in the archives. The only thing was that her letters were censored, I think, obviously by the to some extent by the order itself, but also by the authorities during the war. So sometimes it wasn't, you almost had to read between the lines. But I think I got quite a unique sort of glance at the personal life of a religious person, which is unusual. I don't think many nuns would be exposing their private feelings in that way. Even then, I did find it quite difficult.
Yeah. No, I mean, there's something that comes out from reading the book. She is an enigmatic figure. But I mean, in a sense, it's also sort of a series of fascinating coincidences. I mean, do you think she would have been a doctor if she'd stayed in Ireland and not become a sister?
I don't know. You know, there's some of the gaps are, I don't even know exactly why she chose to do a science degree. She was going to become a teacher, and might have become a teacher. I think she would have been frustrated. I think she would have been unusual. She was an extraordinary person, really, when you think about it, that she was a nun. She loved cars. She loved driving. In fact, she became a doctor. I'm not sure about being a doctor, but I think she would have been an unusual, she would have pushed the sort of gender boundaries, I think, possibly, you know, in what she did, in what she chose to do.
Yeah.
But I don't know if the family had the resources for her to become a doctor. I'm not sure. You know, they were
possible. It's possible.
well off, but not that well off.
Yeah, no, I'm just fascinated by the fact that, you know, she came out to South Africa, she becomes a Dominican, and she's sent off to be a doctor, which is, I mean, it's an unusual thing even today for religious sisters to study medicine. I've known a few from different orders who have been doctors, but many would have, you know, trained in nursing. So it's an interesting suggestion that she, even then, she was breaking some of the gender boundaries and what perhaps would have been a kind of, yeah.
Sorry, I think it was the Mother Superior, actually, of that, who secretly wanted to be a doctor herself. This is my reading. She
okay.
And then she, this young woman came from Germany, actually, who had a science degree, was very intelligent. And then she had Sister Aden with a science degree, very intelligent. And she obviously, and at the same time, the order or the congregation did recognize that there was a tremendous public health needs. So I think the whole thing came together. But the Mother Superior at the time, or the Mother General, I'm sorry, the terminology sometimes escapes me, but I think it's Mother General. She was apparently someone who actually would have loved to have been a doctor herself. And she promoted these two young women and sent them off to Wits. So Sister Aden went with someone else,
That's right. The sister who later left, if I remember correctly.
But she
remained. She left the congregation. Yeah. No, it's very interesting because when you look at, for example, a life of religious missionaries and the kind of stuff of becoming a doctor and stuff like that is usually the kind of stuff that you would think of a, you know, male religious would do. Male Dominicans, Franciscans, such like, they might go off and do those kind of things. So I was rather impressed by the fact that here was clearly somebody in the congregation who was truly a visionary for that time.
Yes.
And it was very impressive. Were you able to track the records of Wits down? I mean, I just wondered, I mean, Wits University Medical Faculty, whether they had any data that might have been useful.
Well, actually, it's interesting because I tried to get the data on Njongwe because I had so little on him that I asked the Wits archives for that, and I got a transcript, and then instantly I got a recall. They said, please, would I not use the transcript because basically they shouldn't have given it to me. And at that point, I was struggling with information on so many different scores that I thought, well, I'll stick with what I've got on Sister Aden without, because one of the things I did have was a photograph, for example, of her class, which is very interesting.
Oh, yes.
But
it's in the book, isn't it?
No, it's not in the book, unfortunately. It didn't come out well enough. It was, unfortunately, but Njongwe is in the class with her. No, I didn't. The information I got was largely from her letters. You know, she seemed to have done very well in pathology of all things. And she did have interesting kind of specializations. But I didn't pursue her actual academic record. As I say, I got frustrated after my first attempt with Njongwe. In fact, there were so many areas where I sort of just had to stop and choose in terms of my time and resources and so on, as to how far I could go in looking for the information.
Okay. Let's move on to the whole question of the massacre. The massacre, the 80 to 200 people. Can you explain to those who perhaps haven't read the book yet, and I emphasize yet, you should all read the book if you haven't read it yet. Could you talk about how you came to that number, 80 to 200?
Okay. So basically, the newspapers the next day were my first sort of port of call. The Daily Dispatch, unfortunately, had a rather too close relationship with the police at that time. They'd been told to keep out of the township on that day, and they did so. And they were very cautious in their reporting. They did say that there were a lot of people killed. I think, I can't remember, it was expressed vaguely. But the Eastern Province Herald put the figure as at least 80 people killed and many more injured. If you speak to people who are survivors from that period, they just talk about hundreds of people killed. Okay, so that is very vague. The main information, of course, comes from a policeman who is still alive to this day, who I mentioned earlier, Donald Card. Now he is a controversial figure, and for those. Because of his controversiality, I think it sometimes is difficult for people to accept that he might be talking the truth on this matter. But he's claimed for a very long time that over 200 people were killed that day. He was 24 years old at the time of the Sister Aidan's murder, and he was one of the five investigating officers. And he stayed with the case all the way through its progression through the courts. So he was very involved in the case, but he wasn't actually at the massacre himself. But he claims that in the investigations afterwards, the police kept an informal record of the people who were killed. And that this informal record was kept in an exercise book, and they totaled up the numbers and it came to 214. And he gives, for example, a lorry load of 22 people that were taken to a township, a burial, to be buried near it was then called Berlin, outside King Williamstown. And also 8 bodies that were taken across the Kai River in a ferry. That was the kind of information that he was working with. I mean, people have said, oh, but how can you trust Donald Card, because he was a security policeman who then did this change in his life and became, supporter of Donald Woods and so on. So what sort of man is he? I mean, it has been difficult. It does raise questions, but I've tried very hard to check his motives and when he started saying this. And he first made these claims that there over 200 people were killed in 1977 in an interview with a woman called Barbara Hutmaker, who was a journalist for a while at the Daily Dispatch. And she wrote a book which was published in 1980. And she records in that book an interview with Donald Card in which he makes this claim. And then over the years, I list them in the end notes, many times where he made a similar claim, but basically it's been ignored. And maybe will still be ignored. It's for all the reasons that we mentioned earlier.
Yeah, I mean, Card is a very controversial figure. I mean, there are a number of articles I've come across, which in fact you use in the book, about him, looking at him as a security policeman, as a police officer, his strong arm tactics, shall we say, in interrogations and various other things. Now, you actually met him, didn't you?
Yes.
What was your impression of him?
Yeah. Look, I come from the Eastern Cape. So, there are lots of people that look like him. When I met him, he was 89, I think, and the second time he was 90. I find that he seems to have a selective memory in that he remembers with minute detail some things and not at all other things. And I would say outright that he was lying, except that everybody I have encountered in this story from that era has a selective memory. It seems that is there something psychological in people that they remember where the times when they were doing the right thing, and they just blot out completely the times when they were doing the wrong thing. because
Yes, I think so.
I just find it difficult to be as judgmental as many people are.
Mm,
So I interviewed him. I was
yeah.
curious. I find him, I need to be on one's guard. He's quite scary, actually, even at the age of 90,
Mm,
But, and I think, you couldn't have been a security policeman at that time without committing atrocities. But incidentally, in the court records, which I have painstakingly been through, like 630 pages, he's not the only person who is accused of torturing. There were a
yeah,
number of them.
number of them.
And I do think because he was such a flamboyant sort of character and so often in the township in so many ways, I do think there is some truth in some of the conflation of, Card being the security police, but where there were others, because in the trial there are others that are mentioned, particularly De Villiers and someone Matthijs and so on. There are a number of names, but he is the one who is definitely most known. But then he changed. Do people change? Well, I don't know.
Yes, people change. Yes. Yeah. Sorry, I just had been interrupted by somebody.
No, I have a feeling. Okay. I think he says that he changed his views because he could see that apartheid was going nowhere and was a failure and was, so it was not so much a moral choice as an intelligent choice in the sense that it's not going to back the losing horse anymore.
Losing side, yeah. Now, I've come across people who've known him, have met him in different places from East London, and they've all said he's a very complicated person. You're not too sure about his what he's really thinking, but certainly, when he acts very decisively.
Yeah.
So, for example, when he decided to opt for supporting Donald Woods, I mean, it was no question about it. He was going to support Donald Woods. Yeah. It highlights the problem, I think, that you struggled with in the book, which I think you've handled extremely well, and that's the problem of unreliable memory and selective memory. And I think one of the things that many people get all excited about is the idea, well, if you've got a historical record, it must be true. And I mean, you look at it and you smile and go, yeah, really? I mean, having interviewed many people myself for research, I mean, it's always a little test. I suppose you've got to schmooze them a bit in order to get the guard down. I mean, I'm being very cynical and giving away all kinds of wicked trade secrets, but it works. But even then, when they're talking, you think to yourself, how much of it is that what they think you want to hear? So yeah, it's always a struggle.
I think what's interesting about Card too is, because people have asked me, how can I trust him and so on. But I find it interesting that people accept his word on the massacre, for example, and then they say that he's lying about the mutilation of Sister Aden. And vice versa. Some people will accept him on the mutilation, but will not accept the massacre. So, it's very difficult, very, very difficult to know people's motives. Also, why do they remember? How accurate is their memory when they are, once you've told a story once, then that becomes the memory, and the way you've told it becomes the thing that you remember. And one wonders where the truth lies when you're 90 years old. I just found it important to go back to the very first time that he was recorded as saying this, and that was for me important.
In the 70s.
Yeah, I don't think it was in his interest then.
Yeah, I mean, certainly, I think it's a very important thing when you do historical research that you battle between the narrative that is given to you and you have to interpret it. I mean, I had a friend who did research in farming communities, rural farming communities in the Western Cape, sharecroppers and such like, and talking to them about their perception of the world and their perception of of, for example, World War II and Hitler was all through the perspective of the Anglo-Boer War. And this was the British came and defeated the Boers in 1902, but then they went to Germany and they started more trouble. And that was the story. Now, what do you do with it? Now, obviously, you don't report this is what happened.
Yes,
so you have to interpret and say, well, what's going on in the minds of the people who tell the story? And I think that's the detective part of the job, There's the evidence, and then you have to actually sit with the evidence and go, okay, well, how do I weigh it?
Yes, yes.
Mm.
Yeah. And also, how do you weigh it without getting so bogged down in insecurity that you give up completely? You can second guess yourself to the point that you just don't write it.
Yeah. No, sometimes you just have to take a chance and say, look, based on available evidence, maybe this is what we know.
Yeah.
Moving to a very delicate subject, which, some people probably don't want to talk about, the issue of cannibalism. Now, I think you establish very clearly, and certainly I've read the case, and it's always been associated with cannibalism, of the cannibalizing of Sister Aden. What do you think was the reason for it? Why did it happen?
Well, that is a $1 million question, to put it mildly. I think there were many influences in the community that sort of came to the fore on that day. After the police had killed, dispersed a meeting by shooting at people, there was a crowd that was enraged, and they were looking for a scapegoat. A white person came along, and they killed her. And in another part of the township, very different people killed a white insurance salesman. The issue is, why did they do to her body, what they did? And I think that is very complex. I first of all do think that there were muti practices in the township that were brought to bear. There was evidence of a particular person who was involved in the cutting. I also, and I think this might be the most controversial side, I do think that there was an influence of well, let's put it this way. There were four young women who were involved around about the scene of the cannibalism. And there were many who had been to the Catholic school and in the mission school. And there were many of the young men or young people who burned down the mission were from that school. And there were kids that when they were marching up to burn down the mission, they were shouting, "Kill the Romans." So there was an awareness of something that was going on at the mission that was being practiced. I mean, looking at anthropological writings and looking at what happened there, I've always wondered, and I do raise this possibility, that the whole misunderstanding of what happens in Holy Communion or in transubstantiation, how were they taught it? Could this have been an influence in what they were doing? I mean, I can't be sure, but I do know that in the time that Sister Aden was there were a lot of new confirmations of young women in the parish, and one does wonder how they mixed in their minds these influences along with everything else in their lives. One of the things that has been one of the very serious sort of suggestions to me has been that I should have taken more seriously the possibility of sort of madness, and not only crowd madness, but the madness of possibly one particular young woman. There has been a suggestion that I should have thought about the phenomenon of amafufunyana, which is a kind of schizophrenia among young women. Yeah, but my method was sticking as closely as I could to what was defined as evidence. So it was people, what people had said at the time, what was found in the court cases, what I found from people's interviews and so on. And although I did think that this particular woman came across quite strangely, and
I was struck by that as well, that whole question.
Sorry, I just...
Use disrespectful.
Sorry, we got some feedback, I think.
Yes, I think
okay,
it's
I think we're back.
Okay. To mute, yeah.
Muting,
Sorry,
yeah. Okay. Yeah, I mean, it struck me that, I mean, this may be a slightly off theory, but in many cultures, when you kill your enemy, you consume their heart to gain the power and the strength, and particularly the courage of your enemy. I mean, this is many conflicts in many cultures. There is this practice of killing and cannibalizing your enemy, not as a sign of disrespect, but almost as a sign of respecting them. But I mean, I don't know. As you say, it's speculative, and we can't really go very far. I want to round off our interview part because I know we need to get some questions for the group. One of the things that struck me is that the Catholic Church in the 1950s, at that time, shortly thereafter, I mean, within a few years it would change, was very cautious politically. And I wondered if that caution was one of the reasons why there was resentment towards the church, let's burn down the Romans.
Well, I do think so, yes. I mean, they... In June 1952, when the Defiance campaign had just begun, I think the Catholic Bishops' Conference put out a statement which basically expressed their gradualist position, if I can put it that way. That African people were not yet ready to, had not yet reached the Western standards which were required for full participation in political life. So I think that was seen as the official position. But within the actual township, it's important to know that while the Catholic Church was very much targeted, and there's quite a lot of evidence that they were targeted as Romans, the Romans, as they put it. There was a bunch of Presbyterian church which was completely untouched, and they had actually made a statement in favor of the Defiance campaign. There was another church, Nicholas Bengu's church, independent church, was also was well regarded. The Methodists also were left alone. There was an Anglican church, a small one, that was burnt down on the second day. But I think one of the things that I noticed, for example, in the Southern Cross, I noticed that while the ANC was boycotting the anniversary of Van Riebeck anniversary, the 300-year anniversary, the Southern Cross actually carried a supplement in Afrikaans promoting the anniversary, which was completely against the Defiance campaign. Yes, I mean, I think the cautiousness didn't help, but there was something happening in the township. The more I think about it, the more there was something going on there that had pitted despite the love clearly and respect for Sister Aden in some respects, there was a concern about what was happening there too. And whether it was the conservativeness or whether it was something to do with remember one thing, when the young woman became confirmed, it affected them. Many families did not want their young woman to become confirmed in the Catholic Church. The chances were they would become a nun. There would be no labolo. It was a big impact on a traditional way of life.
Yeah, that certainly is my impression, and certainly, I think you're spot on. I mean, by the early 50s, I mean, the church was caught in a kind of two-way split. On one hand, they were desperately trying to fit in the sense that, there'd been a history of suppression of the church from 1652 to basically about 86. Catholicism was basically prohibited in South Africa. And then even in the 19th century, there was a lot of anti-Catholic sentiment. So there was almost a kind of church very much on the defensive. On the other hand, the church's universal sense of social justice and the growing influence of somebody like Dennis Hurley, which ultimately won out. I mean, Dennis, Colin Collins, and a whole number of other people who were key figures. Interestingly enough, a lot of Catholics who ended up in the Liberal Party in the 1950s. And in many ways, Hurley's political trajectory, which was the trajectory of Catholicism, almost mirrors the Liberal Party's trajectory. Qualified franchise, universal franchise by the late 1950s, borderline socialist in 1968 when the Liberal Party was banned. So much so that if you look at the Liberal Party constitution and its program in 68, it's almost like the Constitution of South Africa 97. Anyway.
Right. Gunda has asked, Mignonne, did you experience any resistance from the church or state to your desire to publish this book?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Gunda. I certainly didn't experience any resistance from the church in the sense that, well, that aspect of the church that I was dealing with, which was the King Dominicans, who were always extremely helpful and kind and hospitable, and I can only thank them enormously. It would not have been possible if I hadn't had access to their archives and lots of help from Sister Krista, Sister Aloysia, Sister Nabalali, and so on. But and the state, no. I think the only possible I think academics were the most discouraging at times. I was sort of warned that I was likely to be called a racist if I spoke about Sister Aden and, what happened to her. And then, from other side, people are skeptical about, the claims of the massacre. The more I look into the claims of the massacre, the more I think I'm right. But anyway, that's another story. But no, I didn't. I mean, I will say that I tried 3 publishers before I was rejected by 3. The one that was most interested eventually decided that a story about a nun was not going to sell. But I think actually, I think it was more coyness about the material, perhaps. I'm extremely grateful to Tafelberg and also to the commissioning editor, who actually came from East London, went to a Catholic school, she tells me, to St. Anne's, and was amazed that she did not know the story, although she grew up in East London. Mm. And I was so grateful to meet her, and she took on the book, and she really understood what I was trying to achieve. So no, I don't think I got any opposition from the state. I will say that people are reluctant. The same reluctances persist. About. I'll give you an example. I wrote an article for The Conversation about. They invited me to write an article about the book, and then somebody responded. A very interesting response, obviously from someone who was close to the National Party during that time. I almost think I can identify the person, confirming the massacre and saying that they were justified because of the cannibalism of Sister Aden. And the editor instantly closed it down because of the use of the word cannibalism. He asked her, did she have any evidence? And then I don't know what happened afterwards, but the whole conversation was closed down because of hate speech, or they've got certain criteria. Mm.
We have a couple more questions here. Here's one from your sister. Chloe Jones says, "Hi, Mignonne, well done. What has been the reaction of the Quinlan family to your research, firstly, and then to your book?"
Well, the Quinlan family were also extremely kind and hospitable to me when I went to Ireland, to Cork, and they have read the book, received the book, and they actually live in hope, or some of them live in hope, that the church will see Sister Aden as a martyr. I think there are people. There's a whole book of condolences in the archives of Dominican archives, about 130 pages of condolences, many of them referring to Sister Aidan as a martyr of the faith. And subsequently, there've been, people have asked questions: why did the church not recognize her more? I have theories about why, and I think it relates to the fact that the conversation about her is very difficult. The family are very pleased that a book has come out. They have never been condemnatory, actually, of what happened. It's very interesting, but I think because perhaps of the history in Ireland and what they've been through in Ireland, they've never seemed to have condemned any or what happened to Sister Aidan, but rather been understanding of what happened because the people were oppressed. Certainly that is the impression I was given, that her mother, understood that Black people in this country were being treated appallingly. And Sister Aidan did convey that in a very limited way. I don't think she would have been able to say that openly, but it did come across in one of her letters that was not censored.
Question from Sue Custis. Hi, Mignonne. Well done on this project. Why do you think there has not been a more animated response in the South African media to the claims of a massacre so much bigger than Sharpeville?
Well, I think the example that I've just told you about the conversation, when I wrote to the conversation, and there was somebody who clearly was in the know from the police or National Party side, who was confirming the massacre and saying it was justified, and the conversation was instantly closed down. I mean, the chat was closed down. It's because I think it's because I don't know. I mean, I have my claims of a massacre have been reported in all the independent newspapers. The Sunday Times has not taken it up. The City Press, the more mainstream big papers have not taken it up. But they've reported it. They've reported what I've presented. They've largely glossed over the Sister Aidan story. It's been a focus on the massacre, and it's gone that far and no further. But those newspapers are dying. They are small and they are not going anywhere. So it's not a big readership. But I don't know. I think the answer is the same, as that it's difficult. It's still a difficult story to tell. I must just say that I, although we've used the word cannibalism now, I try to avoid it. It's like a red rag to a bull. And it's got so many connotations. It's become a word that if you mention it, the conversation just closes. So it's better for me just to talk about the fact that her flesh was consumed or turned into muti or whatever. But I try not to use that word because otherwise it's, the door's shut.
Oh, thank you.
Can I intervene? Just add something. How do I take this thing off?
Lower hand.
Lower hand.
Oh, right.
Okay. Yeah, got it. Okay. I think you've hit on some very interesting points, Mignonne, and certainly Sue Custis's comments, I think, have brought it out. I think we are caught in a very strange situation where history is part of a political discourse. And that is also part of the church's discourse. And I mean, from a strictly Roman legal point of view, certainly if you could establish that she was killed because she was a Catholic nun, I mean, it's grounds for being killed in odium fidei, in hatred of the faith, and that is a very solid grounds for martyrdom. But all these processes are deeply political. I mean, I'm on the fringe of conversations There's some people who are looking at starting the cause of Dennis Hurley. And that's also a political hot potato. I think many of these things take a long time to gestate, and certainly in some cases of some people who've been canonized recently too quickly, and nasty stuff has come out, embarrassing stuff has come out. It sort of leaves you with the question, oh, what do you do about a saint who may not have been so holy? And you have to do a little bit of theological fancy footwork. But we won't mention any people's names by name. But the other thing in terms of the conversation and the way in which things are shut down, I mean, this is part of an ongoing struggle, and I'm seeing this in academia everywhere, where there are certain things which are sort of considered to be just no-go zones for conversations, which does raise very critical questions about opening up conversations for debate and freely engaging with debate. And there's this mindset that says some things to do, even raise these questions is to cause crisis and disasters and people being triggered and all that stuff. And the result is you get a very, I don't know, what I call a very bland, very vanilla debate going on in many cases, where you speak within certain paradigms, and it's very tricky. Certainly, if you in the academic publishing world, you have to be very careful even how you phrase things. So I'm not surprised that you've had a less than rapturous response from the media.
Yes, I do think though, and it's fortunate that I was a journalist. Otherwise, I probably, in my past, long time ago. Nonetheless, it gives you the courage to sort of go in where angels fear to tread, because academics have not really. I mean, there have been some writings, but I think I've entered territory that is not easy, and won't get me any kudos really in that environment.
At this point, as a follow-up question from Sue, what are your hopes for how the matter of your book would be taken forward?
Well, Sue, I've always hoped that Sister Aden will be recognized for the woman that she is. So, from the very first time I read about her, I was angry that more people didn't know. Not so much. There's that saying, Dido and Aeneas, the saying, remember me, but forget my fate. If one could just remember her for what she was, an extraordinary woman for her time, and just for a moment forget about the fact that she was killed in that way, she would have been a really unusual person, and it would have given us a glimpse perhaps into the life or extraordinary life of nuns, which is not often known. But we only actually got that glimpse because she was killed in the way she was. And with regard to whether she should be acknowledged more, I do think that that question of whether she died because she was a Catholic is a difficult one. It's not really my territory to get into this, but I will just say that I don't think if she hadn't been a nun and she hadn't been trained in the way she was, she would never have gone into that township, into that part of the township that day. And in fact, the earliest responses that I've picked up from people that were recorded in the township was that she went to help people who were injured. And whether that came from her medical training or from her training as a nun, I don't know. But there is also strong evidence that there was antagonism towards the Catholic Church. And I just want to mention something, because it's one of the pieces of information that's come out more for me since I published the book. There was a march apparently in the township some time before this event, where people were displaying a banner saying, I'm not sure the words exactly, but something to the effect of "kill the whole Holy Father because he's leading our people astray." And I thought that that referred to the Pope, but more and more I'm thinking it referred possibly to the Catholic, to the priest in the you know, possibly something to do with the girls being confirmed. You know, the way in which the power of the church, the influence of Sister Aden, the positive influences were also causes for jealousy. So I think it's all tied up. So I'd like her to be recognized in whatever way, but I also really do want people to realize what happened to those people who were killed, and to understand the horrors of that township at that time. Because having come from you know, where I was told the story about Sister Aden's death, but nobody told me about all the other people who were killed, what it was like in the township, or what people's experiences were. And likewise now, I want people to know that not much has changed. It's really, history is potentially repeating itself.
Yeah. History repeats itself. First time is tragedy, the second time catastrophe. If I may misquote Marx.
Yeah, and now, you know, even now with riots happening, one sort of realizes one ignores the poor and the young people at your peril. Because the ANC was involved in conversations, leadership, you know, disputes at this time. They were suffering because of the press, because of the police, but they were also wrapped up in their own disputes. And the young people, disaffected young people, eventually took things into their own hands. And that is something that's repeating itself over and over again.
Yeah.
Hello. Hello.
Hi.
Aloysia. It's Aloysia.
Hi, Aloysia. Hi.
You speak.
Yes. Thank you, Mignonne.
Hi.
I would like to know, did you have any response or reaction from any either members or branch of the ANC to your book? So from the political point of view, you might say?
No, nothing.
No.
Absolutely nothing.
Nothing. Just ignored.
Yeah.
No, from East London itself.
No. No. In fact, yeah.
No. Thank you.
I don't know what you make of that, if I can, if you want to comment.
Yes.
No.
Maybe one of the reasons is that it's part of the past, and so many people are caught up in the present, in the struggle right now, politically motivated to quite an extent again, injustice being perpetrated. So it's a very difficult time. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, it begs a lot of analysis, I think.
No, I think it's true, and in some ways, there's part of me that's relieved, I have to say, because you know, if there was a sudden desire to build a multi-million rand memorial, you know, while people are starving in Duncan Village, you know, I would also find that inappropriate. But yes, you would want some acknowledgement, but I do. I mean, I think there are two things. The one is that the more I look into massacres, you know, generally, because I'm doing a lecture on it, so I'm now kind of trying to broaden my understanding about massacre in this country generally. The more I think, oh gosh, it's so endemic. I mean, there have been so many massacres in this country, and people are probably say, well, that was another one at this stage. You know, we forget that in Duncan Village in 1985, there was a massacre where 23 people were killed. And in fact, Sister Nabalali will tell you about the massacre in Uitenhage in 1985 also. So, I mean, there's so much that has happened that is, that is memorialized to some extent, but this is just one of many for many people. For some of us, it's surprising because we've lived in this cocoon. You know.
Can I also just throw another two small questions? You mentioned that you have varying responses from academics. I noticed that on the blurb on the book is a wonderful blurb by Jeff Perez, of course, who's another Eastern Cape historian of note. How have the academic community, academic historians responded to the book, or has there been any academic response?
Well, the academic responses that you'll see on the book, I have had people who reviewed the book for, and the blurbs on the cover of the book. So,
yeah, Nyamjo and Perez.
Francis Nyamjo and Jeff, yeah, I mean, and Jeff was very, very helpful in advice. Look, chilly silence, I would say. Look, I'm not a historian. I'm treading in somebody else's turf, possibly. It's quite difficult as my field is education, my PhD is in education. And in academic terms, I should be worrying about it, I should write about education, not double in history. But actually, this, as I said, because I was a journalist, I've learned to distrust, those strict boundaries that happen in academia. So when I wanted to find the answers, I just went for it. And I've tried to be as academically rigorous as possible. But I can't say that I've had, from colleagues that I know well, I've had very favorable responses, but I haven't heard anything beyond that. It's all early days. Perhaps I'll get a scathing review. I don't know.
Sure. I mean, it struck me that from the point of view of an academic history, I mean, it's excellent. I mean, and I trained as a historian way back when, but I mean, I certainly thought that from the point of view of actual research, it's excellent research. Even more excellent with the fact that it's actually written in language that's coherent and readable, which was so nice, because a lot of academic history is, it's like sort of swimming uphill through treacle.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate that. But,
I say that with great love to my academic colleagues, but I mean, sometimes I must add, there's, as one who has been involved in the history, particularly of the Catholic Church in South Africa, but also of the history of church and state relations, I have very little material, published material that is, firstly, and secondly, that is good. And I do think this book is a very interesting contribution, because even in Catholic histories of the Catholic Church, I mean, Sister Aden gets us on a little footnote or just a brief reference, and then they quickly pass on, and they get off in a different direction. So I think any kind of work like this, which contributes to a deeper understanding, for example, and the history of the church, the history of church-state relations, the complexities of religion and society, it's very valuable, very important. Obvious question would be, what's next?
Oh gosh, yes. Well, I'm trying to pick up the pieces of all the things I neglected over the years. But if I do write anything, it will have to be something funny. It'll have to be something amusing and light, because this has been a dark story. Yeah. But I write short stories, so that's.
Oh, wonderful. Published many?
No. I hope to publish one day as a collection, but we'll see.
That's great.
A lot of them will be about academia from the point of view of an administrator.
Sounds sort of Tom Sharp. Waterhouse Blue.
Yeah.
Or David Lodge.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. And just, can I just say a thank you to Maggie and Gunda and Samantha for organizing all of this. I'm really very, very grateful. And as I say to Spiritfest generally, for pushing me to finish the book. The 2016 version of Spiritfest was very influential in my completion of this book.
Wow. Well, I would no idea. And I'm so grateful that we were able to just give you a little push without even knowing we were giving you a little push, because really it's tremendous. And thank you very much for being with us, and for a tremendous afternoon, both of you. Thank you, Anthony, for your perceptive questions. Thank you, everybody who contributed questions. And thank you, Mignonne, for sharing so much with us. And as Anthony said, if you haven't read the book, it's time to read it. You can get it on Kindle, or otherwise, how can you get it, Mignonne? Please tell us.
Well, you can order it through Take-A-Lot, through Exclusive Books, or through your own bookshop if they don't have it. Most of the bookshops, the bigger bookshops, do have copies or will get them in for you. It's my name at gmail.com. And thank you very much, Anthony. I was very worried that you were going to be too sick. I've been very anxious about you. Here you are coming through COVID and doing the interview. I'm very impressed. And thanks very much.
Mignonne, I don't know if you're familiar with Monty Python, but if you remember Monty Python and the Holy Grail, there's but a scratch.
Yes.